Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks. If you just take your seats. My name is Ian Whitaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council. We're excited for this evening. It marks the Chicago launch of Eva Daalder and James Lindsay's new book, Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. If you don't have a copy yet, the book is available for sale and signing after the program from our partners, the bookseller. Before we begin, please note we are on the record. We're also live streaming tonight's event. We always welcome social media engagement, but please silence your phones before we begin. The Council is an independent, non-partisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. This program is part of the newly established Leicester Crown Centre on U.S. Foreign Policy. The generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the Centre's work, including the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content more accessible. So thank you to the Crown family, and also thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not a member, please consider joining. We have some of our young professional ambassadors here tonight at the table up at the back there. They'll be happy to take any questions you have about membership. Returning to this evening's program, the conversation will be followed by audience Q&A, as always. We'll be taking your questions from in the room. You can also ask a question online just by opening your browser and typing chi.cnf.io. You can ask a question, you can vote on other people's questions, and we may also feature some of those questions in an ongoing video series we have at the Council called #AskEvo. Now, by way of brief introduction, our speakers this evening are Eva Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He also previously served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO under President Obama, and also previously served on the National Security Council staff as Director for European Affairs under President Clinton. James Lindsay, who's sitting in the middle, is Vice President, Director of Studies, and Morris R. Greenberg Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also previously served on the staff of the National Security Council as Director for Global Issues and Multilateral Affairs, also under President Clinton. And moderating this conversation this evening is Steve Edwards, the Vice President and Chief Content Officer at WBEZ, an organization the Council is very proud to partner with very closely these days. He was also formerly the Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Ian, thank you so much. It's great to be back here at the Council, and Evo and Jim, great to be with both of you talking about your new book, The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. For those of you who have yet to read it, and will have a chance to pick it up at the end of this program tonight, what's fascinating about it is it's an up-to-the-minute, really, account of what's happening inside U.S. foreign policy circles, inside the administration, but also graphed against really the long arc of U.S. foreign policy. And I want to touch on both ends of that spectrum. But before we came out, I asked you to think about one moment over the last, say, 18 months to 2 years that is particularly emblematic in your view of what you find so problematic about President Trump's approach to foreign policy and the current administration, by extension's approach. Jim, how about you begin?
Thank you, Steve, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Chicago. You know, when you asked that question, I mean, the first thing my mind went to is the story we opened the book with, and it's what happens in July of 2017. We're about 6 months into the Trump presidency, and President Trump's senior advisors are concerned about his approach to foreign policy. And then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and Gary Cohn, who's the head of the National Economic Council, think that what they really need to do is to help the president understand better American foreign policy. And they're particularly concerned because the president keeps saying things in public that aren't true. He's pushing them to pursue policies they oppose. And they hit on this idea of having a briefing for the president over at the Pentagon in a place called the Tank. It's one of the most secure facilities in the U.S. government. It's on the outer ring of the Pentagon. It's actually not a very big room. So in July of 2017, it's sort of a who's who of the U.S. Government show up in this room for a briefing, and it's orchestrated again by General Mattis, and he opens up the proceedings, and he opens up the proceedings by saying, in a sense, signaling the purpose of of this whole briefing, that the greatest gift the greatest generation gave us was the rules-based order. Now, of course, that was precisely what Donald Trump had campaigned against during the course of 2016. So over the next hour or so, a series of military officers proceeded to give briefings trying to explain to a president skeptical of America's sort of outsized presence overseas why it made sense, why it promoted American security, why it was that it actually promoted American jobs. This was a big emphasis in the briefing because the president talked a lot on the campaign trail about jobs. The president sat uncharacteristically quite quiet for about the first 55 minutes of the briefing. Then he started interrupting. The president had enough of this tutorial on American Leadership 101 and began questioning his tutors on a whole variety of issues, taking issue with what they had to say. And it went on this way, and it got a little bit more heated. And at the end of the president said to his advisors, "I simply don't agree." Meeting breaks up. They go outside. This meeting becomes famous a couple months later because somebody writes a story summarizing what it was that Secretary of State Tillerson said about the president in the aftermath of the meeting, which was the president is a moron. He put a colorful, not suitable for family audiences adjective in front of moron.
It's in the book.
As he said it. But it's important, this moment, because it captures two important things. One, sort of the gulf between the president and his advisors, who were in essence trying to make him see a foreign policy that he didn't agree with. And the second thing is it shows that the president came to the presidency with a fundamentally different view about American foreign policy and how the United States should act in the world. It's often described as isolationism. That's not really what it's about. It's essentially whether or not the United States advances its interests and values by leading in the world. That's what James Mattis was trying to make to the point that he was trying to make to the president, or whether the United States should view the world as a dog-eat-dog geopolitical competition where there are winners and losers, and America should be a winner, and that's where President Trump is.
I want to come back and talk more about that, but Ivo, something Jim said there is something that I think is also lost in the shuffle in trying to understand President Trump's current foreign policy and his worldview. The idea that he came to office with a very clear idea of what he wanted to do, and that's not necessarily a new idea for President Trump. You go back through his history. You go back to, I remember him on Donahue in '87 talking about trade deals and trade imbalances. So how surprised should we be about the foreign policy that is now being played out and laid out by this administration?
Well, and we shouldn't be surprised. But we always are, and so let me unpack both of those. We shouldn't be surprised because Donald Trump has looked at the world very consistently in the same way, at least since the middle of the 1980s. Indeed, there's we open another chapter with a letter to America that Donald Trump wrote in 1987, published as a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, and it basically. It reads as if it's his campaign speech in 2016. He talks about how allies, our partners in the world, are ripping us off, how they have not invested enough in defense, how they are engaged in trade practices that are deeply disadvantageous to the United States, and that the United States needs to start taking charge once again of its own destiny. He doesn't use making America great again, but he does talk about America needs to stop being taken for a ride and start fundamentally addressing the problems that confront the country, and they are caused by allies. The reason why we maybe, and that's been there for 30-some years. And by the way, he's governed the same way. And in part, the story we tell in this book, with all the ups and downs and all the chaos and the strange stuff that happens, it's a very consistent pattern. And this is where Jim's story comes in. There is this belief on the part of the Washington foreign policy establishment, or maybe even the Washington and Chicago foreign policy establishment, that you can't actually govern this way, that once you become president, in the unlikely event you do, but if you become president, the system will figure out a way to mold you in a different direction. And indeed, it's the failure of the system to mold the president in this different direction that leads to Tillerson and Mattis and Gary Cohn saying, oh my God, we need to teach this guy how important America's leadership role is in the world, and that leads to the tank meeting. But guess what? Of those guys who were there teaching the president how it is that they should lead, they're gone. McMaster was in the room. General H.R. McMaster, National Security Advisor, fired. Tillerson. In fact, the moment that the effing moron comment became public, that was the end of the relationship between the president and his Secretary of State. Fired. Fired by tweet, remember? Gary Cohn left because he lost the internal battle on whether or not to put tariffs on. Replaced by people who are much closer to the president in his point of view, or at least are willing to suspend their own judgment and implement the president's agenda. So that the 30 years ago, how Donald Trump wanted to engage the world, now is the way he's engaging the world. And it's very consistent with this view. And the deep state, the enemies from within, including those people who write anonymous op-eds in the New York Times, they've lost. They didn't find a way to get Donald Trump to do the foreign policy that they wanted to do. Turns out that the president actually is doing the foreign policy he wanted to do. By the way, that's what presidents usually do, so it's not that surprising in this case, and that's why every day when we are surprised that he's getting away with it, we shouldn't be, because he's being president, he told us what he was going to do, and now he's doing it.
I want to get to your example, but supporters of the president would point out that this approach has borne some significant fruit, that we're more engaged with North Korea and perhaps closer to a peaceful deal with North Korea on the nuclear question than we've been in years, that NAFTA, despite all the bluster and threats and concerns all the way around, has actually been now ratified in a 2.0 version with some updates that were missing from the 93 version, et cetera. And that actually he knows something that maybe the Washington foreign policy establishment doesn't realize. What's your response to that?
So two responses, and I'll give Jim, particularly on the NAFTA issue, have Jim respond on that. One is actually, let's look at how those deals pack out. But secondly, what's the cost of actually getting to the deals and the way he gets there? So on the North Korea piece in particular, it's true that the North Koreans were developing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, that accelerated in 2017, and that when President Obama met with President-elect Donald Trump in the Oval Office the day after the election, Obama said to Trump, your biggest problem is going to be the fact that the North Koreans are going to acquire the capability to reach the United States with a nuclear weapon. And Trump rightly has said, well, if you knew that, why didn't you do anything about it? And I think that criticism is a valid criticism. The reason that the Obama administration didn't do anything about it is because it's really hard. And I think that Donald Trump has discovered how hard it is. So first what he did, he says, let's increase the pressure on the North Koreans. And that was the maximum pressure campaign, more sanctions, and he was very successful in getting the Russians and the Chinese to increase the sanctions. He then ratcheted up the rhetoric. Remember, Rocket Man and my nuclear button is bigger than your nuclear button, and all of this stuff that then did lead to a diplomatic opening. And I do think the president can take justifiable credit for that diplomatic opening that occurred at the time of the Olympics back in South Korea. What happened to that political opening? What happened to the political opening is that the deal that we finally settled on was the deal that the North Koreans had offered from the very beginning, which is a freeze for a freeze. We will freeze our nuclear testing and missile testing program if you freeze your military exercise with South Korea. And what was the outcome, with all the bluster and everything else, of the Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un? It was a freeze on nuclear testing and missile testing by the North Koreans, and our decision to freeze military exercise. And that's where we are. We are in a frozen situation, but in the meantime, the North Koreans retain 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. They retain the missile capability, most likely to launch a nuclear weapon against the United States, and that status quo hasn't changed in a very fundamental way.
I hope, I'm going to answer your question, but I hope at some point we'll talk about the things the president hasn't gotten right, because understandably, Trump supporters want to point to what they consider to be victories. But I would note the president walked away from the Paris Climate Agreement and has no plan to address what is perhaps one of the greatest threats facing Americans, climate change. The president moved the embassy to Jerusalem on the grounds that was going to free up the Middle East peace process. It seems to have put it into a tailspin. The president has not addressed the problem of Russian interference in American elections. But let's talk about the wins that are touted. And Ivo is quite right. When you talk about deals, and the president portrays himself as a deal maker, you have to ask more than just the question, did you get a deal? But did you get a good deal, and did you get it at an acceptable cost? So let's take the issue of NAFTA 2.0, which, by the way, hasn't gone into effect yet. It will have to be approved by Congress. It's pretty likely to be approved by the Canadian Parliament and by the Mexican Congress. We'll see what kind of Congress we have come January. But I'll note the following things about NAFTA 2.0, as it's called, or USCMA. As you look at it, it's essentially NAFTA 1.0 with some modest variations. I guess to put it in real estate terms, the president presents this deal as a whole house remodel. And at best, it's really sort of like having a front entryway remodel. And we can argue about how good that entryway remodel was done. What I will note is that a good portion of the changes made under NAFTA 2.0 were things that the United States and Canada and Mexico had agreed to nearly 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, under the so-called TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. So a lot of that were things that we already had agreed to. The other significant change has to deal with...
Which Trump pulled out of.
Which I should say President Trump pulled out of on his third day in office. The other thing, sort of big news under this deal, is the changing the rules regarding the percentage of parts that have to be built within North America. And what's really interesting about that is it's actually going to place a much bigger regulatory burden on American automobile manufacturers and runs the risk of actually making the American automobile industry less competitive over the long term, which will be a real problem, because if you make less money, you have less money to invest, you probably need less workers, and the idea here, of course, is to create jobs for Americans. But as you look at NAFTA, you then have to ask yourself, to get to sort of, in essence, a deal which doesn't look all that much different from the horrible deal we began with, did it come at an acceptable cost? And I would argue no. It really poisoned relations with the Mexicans, clearly created great stresses with the Canadians. And here's just one takeaway that's symbolic. Canada now has a Ministry for Trade Diversification. What that means is the Canadians realize they got a problem with the United States. They got to find other places to sell their goods. That is not good news for Americans. Canada happens to be one of our biggest export markets.
I want to get to your example because my sense, Ivo, is that, and I don't know the exact example, but my sense is it speaks to relationships and this zero-sum approach that doesn't quite measure up when we look at relations in the much broader global context. So what's your specific example here?
So the example, it comes out of my own background when I was at NATO, as U.S. ambassador to NATO. And you remember that during the campaign, Donald Trump campaigned very loudly against NATO. He said it was obsolete and it was time. He really called into question whether the United States should even continue the commitment that had been in existence for 68 years at that point of the United States defending our European countries, and indeed European countries defending the United States. Indeed, the only time that NATO invoked the Article of Collective Self-Defense, Article 5, was on September 12, 2001, in the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And indeed, the Europeans provided air defense capabilities to help police the skies over the United States at that point. But he was, not only does the alliance obsolete, he also, rightly, pointed out that the Europeans hadn't been paying enough for defense. By the way, he is in a long line of presidents dating back to Harry Truman who have complained about the Europeans not doing enough for defense. So welcome to that long list. But he actually had a slightly different view on this. When he became president, Steve Bannon, remember him? Who was the senior advisor to the president, asked the National Security Council, in and of itself very strange for a political person to ask the National Security Council to do anything, but he did, the staff to calculate what the amount of money is that Europe owed the United States. And the National Security Council said, well, actually, Mr. Bannon, Europeans don't owe the United States anything because it's not an organization where you pay money and then the United States takes the money and starts defending you. That's not how it works. Everybody pays for their own defense. And he said, well, yeah, but how much do they owe? Well, you know, when you're in the staff of the National Security Council and somebody high up tells you to do something, so they calculated. They calculated how much more would Europe have spent on defense if all European countries had spent 2% of GDP since 2006 on defense. Why 2006? Obscure reason. There is a reason for it. And when you added that up from 2006 to 2017, the delta between what Europe would have spent if they'd spent 2% of GDP on defense and what they actually spent was $1 trillion. It's a big number. It's one of the reasons why every other president was pushing for a change in European behavior. And indeed, President Obama was able to convince the Europeans in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that 2% mark should be something they should actually adopt by no later than 2024. But that $1 trillion stuck in the president's head. So the story that really captured this was one of the first leaders to come and visit this president in the White House was Angela Merkel. And the Germans, for historical reasons and others, are not big spenders on defense. In part because a lot of their neighbors don't really want them to spend a lot on defense, because the last time they did, it wasn't a happy occasion. But, you know, my view is, and by the way, I'm a Dutchman, I was born as a neighbor, I understand what it is, I still think they should spend more on defense. But she came there, and they had a wonderful conversation. They had disagreement about trade and everything else. And at the end of the meeting, Donald Trump stands up, she's leaving. She says, Chancellor, you're terrific, but you owe me $1 trillion. He then tweets it out the next day, and we tried to explain that that's really not how it happens. But and he's fixated on this. And he's continued to be fixated on it, including in the NATO summit just last July when he said, you owe me money. Well, actually, no one owes us anything other than their gratitude, which is always nice to get. What they do know, they owe themselves to pay more for defense. And so the question is, how do you get the allies to pay more for defense? Do you do it by berating them, by telling them that you owe me money, or do you work with them together to try to achieve that objective? We can have a debate about what's the most effective way. Whether berating allies in the way that he has done is the most effective way is questionable.
And you've spent, both of you have spent time in policy circles and the halls of diplomacy. What's the real world impact at the level of leader-to-leader relations and diplomacy when we have these kinds of interactions between the President of the United States, the Chancellor of Germany, and other matters, whether it's Merkel or it's Trudeau or it's, you know, the Prime Minister of Australia in that first phone call?
Yeah,
that was a great phone call.
Maybe you should tell people what happened on the phone call.
It was first phone call between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister, one of the most important allies we have in the world. There hasn't been a war we haven't fought in which the Australians
haven't put their troops on the front line, including in Iraq and in Afghanistan, even up to this day. And the previous administration, the Obama administration, had negotiated an agreement to take some of the refugees that the Australians had refused to let into their country and were sitting out on Pacific Islands in horrible conditions, and had made an agreement to take, 2,500 refugees into the United States. And Trump said, this is a horrible agreement. It's a terrible agreement. He railed against the agreement. He said, I'm not going to do it. And the Prime Minister Turnbull at the time said, well, but you need to, we have a deal here, you need to keep it. And they're, a terrible agreement. And at the end of it, this is the worst call I've had. I talked to Putin. That was a good call. This is a terrible call. And he hung up on it. That was the introduction of the President of the United States dealing with the Prime Minister of Australia. I think they made up afterwards, by the way.
The transcript is available online if you want to see the entire conversation.
It was leaked. It was leaked to the Washington Post. The relationship between the President and some of the allies is not good. And I think we saw that at the G7 meeting in Quebec, probably most clearly, in which the President of the United States got into a serious verbal back and forth, by the way, on Twitter and TV, with the Canadian Prime Minister, who he called dishonest and weak. And it's a neighbor, it's an ally, it's our most important trading partner, and even if he's dishonest and weak, it's not something that you say in public, because you're undermining that person's standing in his own country. And the same is true with Angela Merkel. The relationship between Angela Merkel and Donald Trump is a terrible personal relationship, to the point that they're no longer capable of really having a conversation. And that means that how do you solve problems together? How do you bring them along to deal with issues that we confront together is made more difficult. That gets to the core argument of our book on the importance of allies in American foreign relations.
I would just note on this, it's a very real problem in interpersonal relations, but it's also a major political problem, because all of these heads of state have publics they're responsible to. And when the president becomes disliked, as President Trump is among many of our friends and allies, it makes it harder politically for those leaders to do what they need to do. I mean, just take the case of... That
is to say, to cooperate with Trump on issues.
I mean, just take the issue
to work with the United States on critical, sensitive matters.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, just take the issue of spending more on defense. It is a position in Germany which is unpopular with lots of people. And when you get up and say we're going to do it, they say you're giving in to President Trump, who's been critical, disrespectful, and has called us a foe. Why should we do that? I mean, leaders have domestic politics just like we have domestic politics. And I think any good statesman takes that into account. This administration hasn't been taking into account.
This book, though, goes far beyond the interpersonal relationships and the challenges and changing nature of U.S. diplomatic relationships now, to the longer, more enduring question of really a shift in the fundamental approach to U.S. foreign policy that has been really consistent over the last 75 years of the post-World War II era. What is the real problem as you see it with what's happening right now in international relations from the American perspective?
Okay. Let me answer your question, but somewhat indirectly, because I want to begin by noting that it's not the case that Donald Trump came to the White House and everything was going well. I mean, President Trump said repeatedly in his first few months in office, I inherited a mess. And it's certainly understandable. You can go through a laundry list of the problems he inherited. A rising China, you have the Islamic State, you have what's happening with the American economy, you have Syria, you have political problems in Europe. Goes on and on. So what's referred to and what General Mattis referred to as the rules-based order, it's also sometimes called the liberal international order, not liberal in the sense of American politics, but liberal in the classic English sense of basically rule of law. That order was in trouble. That was the order that the greatest generation created after the end of World War II. And again, to go back to the point that we made earlier, The greatest generation created this order not out of altruism, not because they were feeling good about other people, but because they were deeply concerned about other people. They had lived through not one but two catastrophic wars in Europe. They had been told that if America stood apart, retreated to Fortress America, America would be secure. That myth ended on December 7th, 1941. When you think of people like FDR, Harry Truman, Dean Anderson, George C. Marshall, they were very pessimistic about where we were headed, and they wanted to create an order that would diminish the chances of a repeat of World War I and World War II. And their conclusion was the way to do that was for America to lead. What did leadership mean? It meant that the United States would work with its friends and allies to address common problems. In essence, we would be the catalyst that would mobilize collective action, because they realized that if they didn't, they were going to get a repeat of World War II. So it was based on a hard-headed geopolitical calculation. But 70 years on, that political order was showing its age, as you might imagine. It was showing its age partly because you have countries, think Russia, that never accepted it, wanted to go back to that geopolitical world of dog-eat-dog politics. It was in trouble partly because it succeeded so well. What was the American message to the world? Democracy, open markets, ticket to success. Well, certainly after the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Soviet Union goes on the ash heap of history, we saw that that was a workable recipe. But what happened? Power got distributed. Countries rose up. Many of them were quite happy to enjoy the benefits of this liberal or rules-based order, but didn't want to pay for any of the costs. Finally, you had a problem, some significant American misjudgments. The American invasion of Iraq, a military action that was not required by a need to maintain an order. In fact, most of our friends and allies cautioned us against doing it, saying it would take us into a maelstrom. They were right, we were wrong. I think also 2008, 2009 financial recession, where you had sort of the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis spread around the world. That really raised real questions about the judgment in Washington, D.C. So I say all that because I don't want to argue that somehow there was a beautiful garden in the Trump presidency made it a mess. But we do have these significant problems, and the question is, how do you go about fixing them? And I was remarking to Ivo earlier, a story we tell in the book about President Obama leaving a letter behind for his successors, particularly it's an American tradition. And one of the three things he said to President Trump was that you should go about trying to find a way to strengthen this rules-based order. It was advice I think President Obama gave in a very heartfelt sense. It's advice that President Trump has not taken. And it gets to a sort of essential irony in the sort of Trump foreign policy, which is that President Trump has argued throughout the campaign that our friends and allies haven't done enough. As Ivo points out, he's been making this case since at least 1987. As president, he hasn't done the sort of things to get our friends and allies to do more. Just take one quick case, Chinese predatory trade practices. The president is quite right. China doesn't play by the rules. It exploits the rules. It bends the rules. It ignores the rules. But did the president go out and solicit all of our friends and allies in a mutual effort to push the Chinese? You would imagine that would be a pretty wise thing to do, given the amount of economic heft we could bring to bear, more than half of the world's GDP. No. First thing the president does, as we discussed earlier, is he leaves the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was designed to be a counterweight to Chinese power. Our friends and allies are interested in working with us on the China issue. The administration has given them the back of the hand. We're actually in trade wars of varying degrees of heat with our friends and allies. We've imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on our friends and allies on national security grounds. Apparently, Canadian steel is a threat to American security. That has practical consequences. CEO of Ford Motor Company said it's going to cost his company $1 billion. That's going to hurt their productivity, their competitiveness, and that's going to have ripple effects for workers at Ford and the American economy more broadly.
You know, Jim, you articulated a lot of the weaknesses or criticisms around this notion of the liberal hegemonic world order as it was getting on in years. Ivo, John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, has a new book out where he's very critical of that, noted realist. The book's called The Great Delusion. He argues that we actually need to retrench from and pull back from this kind of expansionist view. What's the argument against that and in favor of continuing to be engaged and have America's role in international affairs be central, to be actually continuing to occupy the throne, as it were?
So, John is right, and we, in fact, argue ourselves in the book, that if you look at the post-Cold War foreign policy of the United States in the 90s and the 2000s, it was infused with a kind of hubris about how much we could accomplish. We came out of the Cold War as victors, as the biggest, most important power, the hyperpower, as the French foreign minister called it, the unipolar moment, as the late Charles Krauthammer christened it. And we believed that with that power, we could hasten some very positive developments. Remember, this was the time of Frank Fukuyama talking about the end of history, the belief that liberal democracy not only had won the Cold War without fighting a shot, but was really where the future was going to go. And we could use the power, not only of our attractiveness, but the power of our military capability to get more countries to become liberal democracies. We also believed that if we could open up markets in Russia and in China, that the economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. And this was a joint Democratic and Republican strategy that people adhere to. And it turned out we were wrong. We were just plain wrong. And John spends his book talking about how we were wrong and why we were wrong. And if you want to get his view of that, go out and read it. But we were wrong for a whole bunch of reasons. The answer, therefore, is not to say, well, let's just retreat. The answer is to say, no, we were wrong, but it doesn't mean that a rules-based order isn't important. And we go back to the 1930s and do the geopolitical competition that we were used to. What you do as you decline in your power, which in the United States is, we were at this extraordinary height in 1945, we came down by the Cold War, then we were again at that extraordinary height. We've come down again for natural reasons. When countries grow, they become more powerful. The question is, how do you compete effectively? Well, one is you create an order that people have to compete within, so you constrain the nature of their competition. And the second thing you do is you work with those people who are on our side. We have one advantage. It's a huge advantage over every country in the world. We have allies. The Chinese and the Russians have clients. It's a very different relationship. And having those allies on our side means that when we need to compete, as we do with the Chinese on economic matters, having them on our side is likely to be far more effective than if we push them away. Jim talked about it in terms of the economic power. Let me talk about it in terms of military power. 6 of the 10 largest militaries in the world are our allies. 7, by the way, of the largest economies in the world are our allies. If you add allied military and economic power with the United States, that's more than 50% of global GDP and more than 70% of global military power. So if you find a way to husband allies, work the hard diplomatic, and it's hard and it's frustrating to work with allies, let me tell you, it is. It's much easier to just go out and do your own thing. But if you get them on your side, you can actually accomplish things that you yourself cannot. That's the fundamental understanding that, by the way, I think John Mearsheimer misses when he talks about, let's just dismiss Europe, and if they go to war, it's their problem, not ours. Last time they went to war, it turned out to be our problem, and a very costly one indeed.
We're going to go to your questions in just a second. We're getting many of them here on the screen. There's one that's a great follow to this. Jim, you were talking earlier that President Trump, his foreign policy at times has been linked to a sense of isolationism, which is not exactly right. I think you could fairly say, as you do in the book, that, and Eva was alluding to it earlier, there's a sense of winning and zero sum and the United States getting ripped off. So one of the questions here is, what do you think is the difference between winning in the world as opposed to leading in the world?
Well, winning in the world proceeds from an assumption that we're involved in a zero-sum endeavor. I win, you lose, you win, I lose. Okay, in real estate, that's probably true. If I pay more for a house than you were willing to sell it for, I, in some sense, have lost. I think the great lesson from the greatest generation was that if you take that view of world affairs, you're going to end up less secure and less prosperous over the long term. Again, I go back, to your previous question about John Mearsheimer, well, realists think that. I think Harry Truman and George C. Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy would take exception to any suggestion they weren't realists. I think they would suggest they actually understood the world a lot better. And that, in fact, the United States, by being interested in leading, accomplished two things. One, it actually reduced geopolitical competition. Okay, let's go back. 1930s, when America stayed home, the British, the French, the Germans are all competing for power. Okay, in some sense, one of the great successes of the rules-based order is we took those great powers out of the geopolitical game. We're better off for it. Longer-term consequences, when you create security, you create the grounds for greater prosperity. Okay? If you look over the last 70 years, it's not just the case that our friends and allies did really well. Americans did really well. And I understand that you're not going to argue that everybody benefited equally from what happened. But I will note, you're talking about the president, looking at this issue of isolationism, his argument wasn't that we're going to get other people to spend more so that we can spend less. He's in essence arguing we're going to continue to spend more. And again, sort of looking at, if you look at it in terms of economic terms for the United States, the costs of leadership haven't been that high. Let's just look at one measure, which is the size of the U.S. military. Today, it's about shade under 4% of U.S. gross domestic product. But if you were to go back to when I was in diapers, you're talking 10% of U.S. gross domestic product. Okay, and people say, for example, but then, we're spending our blood and treasure in wars overseas. But again, I will note that the Iraq invasion was not mandated by a leadership role. Indeed, many of our friends and allies said, you should not do that because it is going to turn into a disaster. We gave them the back of our hand. We argued that French fries should be rechristened freedom fries and good red wine should be poured down the drain. So I think it's important to be realistic about what our policies actually have been and what they actually cost us.
Let's take other questions from you. If you can put your hand up, and we'll ask that you keep your questions short and to the point, and we'll get to as many of you as possible. There's a question all the way in the back of the room that we'll start with, and I'll filter in some of these others too.
The latest source of heartburn for me is the promise or threat that we're pulling out of the INT. But I've also read some compelling stories. It's really about China, or they're already breaking the treaty. I'm curious what your thoughts on how credible are the opportunities and certainly the threats.
So that's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed in 1987 that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons between 500 and 5,500 kilometers of ground-based nuclear missiles. And the administration, the president announced over the weekend that we were withdrawing from this treaty really for two reasons. One, because the Russians were cheating. And he said, why are we adhering to a treaty when the other side is not? That doesn't make sense. And secondly, because the Chinese were not party to the treaty and were developing these kinds of missiles, and we needed to have a counter to that. And both of them are, in fact, valid arguments. And as John Bolton said the other day in Moscow, the strategic situation has changed, and we ought to adjust with the time. The real question you need to ask is twofold. One is, if we were to walk out of the treaty, will that make us more secure? And secondly, and this gets to our main theme, this is a very peculiar treaty. It was actually a treaty that was negotiated because the NATO alliance decided that it was going to respond to a Soviet military threat by deploying INF missiles in Europe in the hope that it would convince the Soviet Union then to negotiate an arms control agreement, which they did. It was extraordinarily successful. So this was not just an agreement between the United States and Russia, it was really an agreement that NATO had been part of. The decision whether or not to walk out of this agreement was made by the United States without talking to anybody in Europe. Probably not a good idea. Why? Because the Russians are now free to deploy whatever they want. And the Europeans are going to say, well, don't ask us to deploy systems on our territory. You didn't even ask us whether you wanted to stay in the treaty. So here's the issue. Russia and China, because of geography, can deploy short and medium-range missiles and threaten all kinds of neighbors. When we deploy short and medium-range missiles in the United States, we can threaten Canada and Mexico, which under certain circumstances may be okay, but isn't the point. We can't actually reach Russia or China with missiles, short and medium-range missiles, on our territory. We have to deploy them on the territory of our allies. That means you actually need to have good relations with your allies to convince them to do that. And right now, it doesn't look like we have the kind of relationship with a South Korea or a Japan or Europe to get that kind of deployment.
Which speaks to her passing reference to concerns about China being able to deploy these missiles. Your argument basically would be you deal with that problem separately, and you deal with it through strong relations with allies, and then you work
strong relations with allies, and you do it with other systems,
yeah.
Sea and air-based systems, which are not banned by the treaty.
Other questions?
Just one quick thing on that point, which is to keep in mind that the South Korean government faced a major political crisis over its decision to deploy a defensive missile system designed to shoot down missiles coming into South Korea. It is hard to imagine that the South Koreans are going to embrace the idea that they are now going to host U.S. nuclear forces.
We have a couple of hands here and then one up here. So we'll start here in the front row, and then there are a few back on that side.
Thank you for the presentation. And the book should be very interesting.
It is very interesting.
We haven't given you any of it.
I like to read about the past, but I'm more concerned about the future. Can you look into the next 2 to 6 years, and do you see changes in the behaviors that we've seen for the last 2 years and the policies? Do you see it getting worse? Do you see it getting better? Do you see it getting the same for that period? What should we anticipate?
I would imagine you're going to see President Trump continue to pursue what he calls his America First policies. I think one of the things that's interesting in looking at the first, I guess we're now 22, 23 months into the administration, is that initially the president was unsure. He did defer to his advisors, at least on some tactics. And it was somewhat of a surprise, the people he picked to staff his team. These are all traditional mainstream foreign policy types. As Ivo pointed out earlier, most of those people have now left the administration. There are more people in the administration who either share the president's views or see their job as enacting the president's views. Look, today I was struck by watching the 60 Minutes interview about 10 days ago with Leslie Stahl. What I saw was a president who is supremely confident in the fact that he's president, that he knows what he's doing, that he doesn't have to take the advice of others. And again, the president has been very consistent going back to when he was on the campaign trail. When he was asked, who's your closest advisor? He essentially said, me. And I think you're going to see the president pursue his views. And I think that may even intensify if this blue wave, which has been long rumored, materializes in November. It may not. But if Democrats were to take control, let's say, of the House of Representatives, it'd be very hard to see the president's legislative agenda going anywhere on Capitol Hill, and that will naturally push the president into foreign policy. That's an area where presidents clearly have a lot more discretionary authority, and the president's indicated he has very strong views about how to conduct American foreign policy.
I'm going to go here and then back there to that hand, yeah.
The president very proudly declared a couple of days ago that he is a nationalist, and he had enthusiastic followers. How can you or somebody explain to these people that nationalism is what caused World War I and World War II, and that's not a good thing?
Well, I think you just explained it really well. I mean, there's a reason why presidents have in the past not used the notion that they are nationalist, for the very reason that you have laid out. Nationalism tends to lead to conflict in one form or another because you have to differentiate yourself from others. And as a result, you can still be proud of your nation. You call yourself a patriot, but not necessarily a nationalist. The other problem with nationalism, particularly for an America that is increasingly diverse, is whose nation are you saying you are representing? And in that sense, it can also be at home a very divisive kind of way. Whether that was meant in that way or not, I don't know, but that is part and parcel of the consequence of that statement. It's a worrisome idea. I mean, he is a nationalist. America First is a nationalist conception, quite apart from its unfortunate historical connotation, which people in Chicago ought to know, since the America First Committee, of course, was headquartered here in Chicago back in the 1930s. But there are ways to make the case that we are proud Americans without having to resort to the kind of language that he is now resorting to. But that's, this is not a new phenomenon when it comes to Donald Trump and the use of language.
We'll take the hand that's been back here. There were two there. And then we've got a hand right here.
Thank you for hosting
Top
this
question.
discussion.
Of course.
The Economist has dubbed the 21st century the Chinese century. So I guess my question is, what do you believe is the best containment strategy for the United States with the rise of China, if that's even the right strategy moving forward?
I'm not sure I would call the 21st century the Chinese century. Certainly China has lots of things going for it, but it's pretty easy to list a lot of things China has going against it. I will note it's a country that is going to grow old before it gets rich. We've never seen that before. It is a country that is run by a one-party, or it's one-party system, and its legitimacy rests fundamentally on whether or not it can deliver the economic goods. The ideological legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, think Mao, is gone no matter how many Mao posters you might see in Tiananmen Square. So if economic growth slows down, what are the political consequences? Moreover, the Chinese Communist Party hasn't demonstrated itself as basically being that stable. And you look at Chinese history, one of the great fears in China, and one argument for authoritarianism, is that China has descended into chaos, being ripped apart by its divisions. We can go on. So I don't want to cede the 21st century to the Chinese. I also don't think that a containment strategy, as you laid out, is likely to work or is going to be effective. You could certainly have a counterweight strategy, and that was the idea, the intuitive logic behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Think the Obama administration's rebalance or pivot. The idea was China is a rising power. It will, like all rising powers, want to change the rules to its advantage. So what we should do is to create essentially a counterweight that makes it very hard for the Chinese to do that. And again, the Trump administration, President Trump, third day in office, leaves the TPP without any strategic analysis of what this actually meant. It was simply, if you look at there's a famous photo of Steve Bannon's office with a whiteboard, and there's a check mark next to it because, campaign promise made, campaign promise carried out. And of course, presidents or candidates often make lots of promises on the campaign trail that perhaps are better left on the campaign trail. But the president also had no alternative strategy. Okay, we had disruption without follow-through. I think that's actually a trend throughout the Trump presidency. There's a tendency to just disrupt things, and as the president often says, we'll see what happens. And I think that's a very dangerous strategy because a lot of these consequences are easy to anticipate. In fact, have been anticipated. And what leaders need to do and what good advisors to leaders try to do is to anticipate the various consequences and then have counters should those occur. So now we have a move against China in which we are imposing tariffs. And we're imposing tariffs. At the end of the day, here's the question you'll hear from the Chinese. We have no idea what it is that the president wants. Do you? Right? And the key to making a deal is you have to figure out what you're arguing over. And Vice President Pence, about 10 days ago, gave a speech, which was really a bill of indictment against China. And it's
not a clear list of demands or concessions.
But in essence, it's like, this is what we don't like about you. And the only thing that should have come out of it is the only way the Chinese could satisfy it is through capitulation. And they're not going to capitulate. So the question is, what are we arguing about? Is this about the size of the bilateral trade deficit? At times, that's what the president has made it seem to be about. Is it about Chinese theft of intellectual property? We've had some conversations about that. Or is it about the fact that China has state-owned enterprises that don't quite fit into a capitalist free market economy? And if you look at the administration, there are people in different parts of the administration arguing that one of those things should be the thing the administration is fighting for. But it's not clear that this administration is on the same page about what it is trying to achieve. So you have disruption with no clear goal and no strategy to achieve that goal that we're uncertain of.
I want to close with two questions here that many of you have posed through the online mechanism. The first follows what you were just talking about to some extent. There is this sense that that in our system, in the American system, that administrations come and go, that different policies are emphasized, and that actually that part of, in fact, David Axelrod talks about the sort of reaction to the existing president. So hypothetically, in 2020, there could be either a re-election of Trump or a reaction to Trump. Assuming the latter scenario, one of the questions is, what then should be the top foreign policy priority for the next president, with the assumption that could this be put back together again? So, Eva, what's your sense of what the top foreign policy priority should be for the next U.S. president, whether it's 4 years or 8 years out, or 2 years or 6 years out, rather?
I think it's a recommitment to the fundamentals of the rules-based order and the reestablishment of strong relationships with our allies and friends. And a commitment to diplomacy to get that done.
And is it repairable? Can it be reconfigured in the way that you and Jim articulate has been so powerful in its existing manifestation?
So it becomes more difficult to repair the longer the breakdown takes place. And one of the things we struggled with is the damage that's done irreversible, or is there a way to reverse it? And so the good news, I think, that we came up with, no, it's not irreversible. That there is sufficient time for us to come back to the importance of understanding what the rules-based order is. But it would be greatly helped if our allies actually start behaving in ways that are supportive of that rules-based order and take ownership. And rather than turning inwards and saying, oh my God, the world's coming apart, to say, okay, what steps can we take to maintain that rules-based order? That's already happening on the trade side. And it's happening pretty well on the trade side. TPP did not fall apart when the president took the United States out. The 11 other countries said, we're going to maintain whatever it is that we can maintain. In response to the activities, the tariffs and other activities with regard to our allies and friends in Europe and in North America, the Europeans and the North Americans say, you know what, we'll negotiate new agreements with Japan, which is what the EU did with Canada. Mexico is looking for new agreements as well with the EU. Australia has become part of that. So there's a global trading system that is being maintained by the fact that our allies, which are important economic actors, are maintaining this. We would want the same to happen in the security area, and in some ways it's happening. Take Iran as an example. It's unfortunate, I think, for the United States to be confronted with the reality that whereas a few years ago the United States led not only our allies, but the Russians and the Chinese in confronting the Iranians and led to a deal, however bad or good that deal was. It was a deal that was negotiated. And now we're turning around. It is Tehran that is leading Russia, China, and our allies in opposition to the United States in order to maintain that deal. And so our allies, in this sense, are at least trying to maintain that part of the rules-based order as part of it. So if allies, and Jim and I have a piece in Foreign Affairs, which is not in the book, but is the logical consequence of that. If allies, which we call the G9, the 9 most important allies the United States have, were to come together to uphold the rules-based order from which they have benefited extraordinarily, then if there is a change in administration or a change of approach, maybe not even a change in administration, you can always hope, that a different approach on the part of the United States, that then the leadership can reemerge on the part of the U.S.
Let me close with a related question, and it's atop our list here for each of you, and that is, would you encourage students, those interested in national security, to pursue a career like both of yours, and they say in such mad times or in these times?
I would say definitely, precisely because of these times. And I think, one of the important things, two important things to say. One is that government service is laudable. I know it's fairly common for people to complain about government bureaucrats and the rest. I've had the pleasure of working in government. What I saw were people who were working really hard, who believed in the United States of America, believed in their mission, believed in supporting the president. They may not even be in the same political party as the President of the United States. And they worked incredibly hard and made a lot of sacrifices, a lot of personal sacrifices on behalf of or for their government. Second thing I would say in terms of this, and you talk about this a lot in the book, is one of the unfortunate consequences of the Trump administration is that a lot of our personnel are leaving government. We've seen this most clearly in the State Department, where the new leadership, in essence, didn't believe in diplomacy. And so you've seen an exodus of really talented people. For those of you who've ever been in an organization, you know it is your best people who leave first, precisely because they are the best. They can find somewhere to go. And as you all know, working in any organizations fundamentally depend upon people who can get things done, who have expertise. And we're hemorrhaging it right now. So if you're thinking about going into study foreign policy, work in government, you're even doing it locally, I say do it. It's precisely because there are so many challenges out there to deal with, that we live in a world in which problems do not stay at home. They cross borders. You need more people to study, to understand those issues, to learn the perspectives and views of others, and to make a difference.
Let me just add to, because I completely agree with the answer. We screwed it up. Our generation. We didn't do it in the right way. The problems that are there are part and parcel of the policies that our generation pursued. Unfortunately, it is up to your generation, the next generation, to help fix it. It's your country, it's your world, and you're not going to be able to fix it if you're not part and parcel of the solution. And the more of you, and there are students here in the audience, the more of you who decide that you want to be part of this extraordinary effort, which doesn't only have to be in government. There's lots of other places you can be involved in making the world a better place. The better it is for everyone. We need the energy, we need the ideas, we need the the conceptualization that comes with a new generation each and every time to make sure that the mistakes that previous generations made are not repeated, and the new opportunities that are out there are exploited as much as possible. If the lesson is that the times are so bad I don't want to be part of it, that's the wrong lesson. The lesson is if the times are that bad, go out and be part of the solution. You're more likely to be able to do that than those folks like us who may have screwed it up in the first place.
That's a fitting note to end on. The book is called The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. It's the work of Ivo Daalder and Jim Lindsay. Ivo, Jim, thank you so much.
You.
Yeah.